back. Okay, so no further ado, Marco.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you for the invitation. Although it's the third location of SPRU that I see, I always feel at home. Differently from previous seminars I gave in the last few years, today I'm not presenting results, empirical results or econometric stuff. This is just a kind of position paper. When you are getting older, you start to be asked to write down survey. And that was the case. The World Bank, and particularly the branch for Latin America, the World Bank asked me to have a kind of survey position paper on the topic of entrepreneurships, both in terms of the impact in richer and developing countries, in developing countries. So I enjoy actually the task. It was an opportunity even to sum up and to think about my own work in the past 10, 15 years. I assume that you know Mariana's book about the entrepreneurial state. In Mariana's book, you basically have two animals. You have an aggressive, smart lion on the one side, and a kind of quiet, a little bit fat cat on the corner. And economists, the conventional wisdom is that the smart lion is private entrepreneurship, while the fat, lazy cat is the state. And Mariana quite effectively convinced the reader that the state can be entrepreneurial and can be actually a driver of change, particularly in key periods like the one we are actually inside, that is could be thought as a transition from one paradigm to another paradigm. This position paper is complementary, is trying to convince you that the smart lion in the conventional wisdom, that is private firms, new entries, startups, entrepreneurships, can actually be disentangled in very, very different animals, not just the lion, and probably the lions are the minority. And so it's a kind of critical view on the concept of entrepreneurship. So from this point of view, it's really complementary. Is entrepreneurship in general sense is something good? It's difficult to answer. Actually, you have a spectrum of different opinions on private entrepreneurships. My friend and co-author, David Aldrich, together with many other scholars, think to be that entrepreneurship is something to add to an endogenous growth model that, together with R&D and human capital, has to take into account entrepreneurships as a driver of economic growth. In the middle of the spectrum, we can refer to Baumol. Baumol actually advised us more than 20 years ago that within startups, within new ventures, new firms, you can find very different animals, ranging from the Schumpeterian smart entrepreneurs and innovative entrepreneurs to the defensive and, in a way, very, very fragile kind of new ventures and enterprises. Talking about developing countries, this kind of survival-driven self-employment, defensive self-employment, is quite common. If you take the statistics about new entries or new ventures or new firms in developing countries, you take into account real business, and you take into account street vendors. I was recently in Colombia, and a huge amount of the labor force is actually self-employed in this kind of personal services and small trades, small retailing. Is this entrepreneurship? We have to think about. Scott Shane got a prize on entrepreneurships by the Swedish Academy, something like that. Actually, giving a lecture after the prize, very, very skeptical about the apologetic view of private entrepreneurship. And I quoted it. Policymakers believe a dangerous myth. The idea is that there is a kind of confidence in entrepreneurship as something, a magic bullet, he says, to solve the problem, to drive growth. While is recognizing that the typical startup, the majority of new firms, the typical startup are not innovative, creates few jobs, and generates little wealth. So, you go from a very, very positive and optimistic point of view to a very, very destructive one. So what is entrepreneurship? And here again, we have to compare the traditional economics point of view, especially within the industrial organization literature, and a much more complex and much more satisfactory view of entrepreneurships. In terms of the microeconomic textbooks, entrepreneurship is just the process of new firms entry. New firms are the new enterprises, are the a kind of measure of entrepreneurships. The global entrepreneurship monitoring, looking at new entry rates and statistics about self-employment all over the planet, all over the world, found out a U-shaped relationship between a country rate of entrepreneurial activity and economic development. That means that entrepreneurship seems to be very, very high in terms of new entry of new firms in a very rich country, in a very poor country. And that's because in this kind of measures, you put together Mark Zuckerberg in the US with a state vendor in Nepal. In both cases are new firms, self-employed, but of course very, very different animals. Only when, and Zoltan Axe made this exercise, only when you take into account the real entrepreneurs, so you drop the defensive necessity entrepreneurs, people that actually start a new business just because of, for instance, just for escaping from unemployment, using David Story's wording. If you take out this kind of necessity entrepreneurs, you have a positive relationships in between entrepreneurships and economic development. That's okay from a statistical point of view, but as we say as economists, this could be affected by an important endogeneity problem. We don't know whether entrepreneurship is actually driving economic growth or simply the reverse, taking out the necessity entrepreneurs, good economic condition foster a kind of progressive entrepreneurships. So it could be the reverse causation. So even when we have a positive linear relationships, we cannot conclude that entrepreneurship is a driver of growth.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So are you saying there have been studies that have taken that out?
Sorry?
There have been studies that have tried to control for the employment?
Yeah, since in the GEM statistics, at least for some countries you can distinguish, they drop this kind of observation and they recover with a positive linear relationships.
But doesn't that capture two, well, I don't know if you should ask now, but just to clarify before you move on, the employment effect, there's two fundamental reasons. One is literally like maybe in a crisis, or you're going to get unemployed, so you set up your own business. But in terms of technologically, so innovation-wise, if you think that you're at the end of an industry that's about to sort of die, you foresee the opportunities in a new industry.
absolutely.
How do you?
No. In their exercise, they just take the rate of self-employment. So they don't measure the job potentialities of the new firms. That's the distinction that David did in between purely self-employment and job-creating new firms. But we will come back on this in a few minutes. Of course, when we talk about different countries at a very macroeconomic level, we have to take to account a lot of institutional constraints that make the situation very different across countries. And this is particularly a focus of the World Bank, underlining that, let's say, progressive entrepreneurships can be hindered by problems in the capital market, and a kind of problem in red tape's regulatory environment. And this is quite common even in richer countries, while peculiar to the developing countries, it could be that even the good portion of entrepreneurships is actually stopped by obstacle in terms of infrastructure, even roads or providing of basic services like electricity and so on, and very important in developing countries, bribery. Corruption is actually magnify the problems in terms of imperfection of labor market, of capital markets. So it's surely true that in developing countries, situation is quite complicated in terms of market failures, but still, even in developing countries, they need to distinguish the different categories of inverted comma entrepreneurship is important. And to provide some results from the empirical literature to show you how this kind of entrepreneurships could be very different in terms of impact, in terms of job creation and so on, I tried to summarize some kind of stylized facts from the economic and not only economic literature. First of all, if we look at industrial dynamics statistics, we can conclude that in between around 50% of new ventures is doomed to early failures in the first 5 years of activities. In an OECD studies, Stefano Scarpetta and co-authors found something less, but that is actually excluding purely self-employment. If we take into account individual firms, this is about 50% of early failure. So in terms of job creation, this is important. That creates just an illusion of employment. Entry and exit are significantly correlated. This is coming back to a stylized fact underlined by Paul Jarosky 20 years ago. Entry and exit are correlated, not only statistically. I mean, most of exit is explained by young firms that actually enter the market and exit in 2-3 years. What we call revolving door firms, just coming in, coming out. From this point of view, some kind of policy that actually incentivate this kind of turbulence, has been called by the literature, are very, very short-term kind of policies in terms of job creation, in terms of actually sustaining long-term economic growth. Second point, second dimension, in order to disentangle and to make distinction, the technological content of new ventures and new firms. First of all, you have different sectors. So if Luca Grilli is talking about new technology-based firms, is a kind of entrepreneurship. That is, new ventures are very likely innovative in high-tech sectors. That, of course, is very different from self-employment or startups in a traditional sectors with no technological content. And so again, the need to distinguish in terms of policy making. In developing countries, most of new ventures, they are just confirming the status quo in a way and are concentrated in low-tech traditional sectors. Even, that's even more skeptical. This is Baumol, book a few years ago. And Baumol is even more skeptical, saying that even when we focus on innovative firms and high-tech sectors, so innovative enterprises, innovative new ventures, it says that most of this innovation is a kind of imitation, replicative variety. Slightly better mousetraps. Superstars are really exceptions, even within the innovative firms. This is actually consistent with Schumpeter. Schumpeter is always quoted by the apologetic view, conventional wisdom about entrepreneurship, saying that, wow, look at the Schumpeterian entrepreneurs. They are a driver of growth, they are a driver of innovation, and always quoting Schumpeter. But if we go back to the theory of economic development, Schumpeter is talking about one leader that is the first and the real innovative entrepreneur, and the cluster of imitators, a cluster of followers. So it's not a surprise that even within the innovative entrepreneurs, few of them are actually the real innovative and the revolutionary one. So there's a need to distinguish in between the innovative and non-innovative, in between sectors, and even within new technology-based firms, the superstars from the others. If there is this kind of diversity and variety of animals within the concept of entrepreneurships, and I like to use these words because as an evolutionary economist, I think that diversity is one of the things that we have to keep in mind in any kind of study. We can open up a little bit the black box of the motivation, the drivers of entrepreneurships, and to see whether there is some kind of link in between motivation, drivers, characteristics of the entrepreneurs, and post-entry performance. Post-entry performance, even in terms of survival. We have seen that survival is very low on average, but also in terms of job creation, in terms of profitability, productivity, and so on. Economists, as usual, they oversimplify. And so if we go back to macroeconomic textbooks, it's saying that new entries, entrepreneurship, is driven basically by two things: expected level of profit and discounted by endogenous and exogenous entry barriers. And that's all. I'm not saying that these are not important. They are extremely important, but are not enough. As Schumpeter and others, Frank Knight, for instance, talking about the distinction in between risk and uncertainty, and talking about the role of entrepreneurs, is looking also at other characteristics, and not only the purely economic variable. For instance, it's not true, as is thought to the economic students, that the potential entrepreneur out of the markets is just looking around, whereas a profit expectation is going there. It's not true. As every individual, the potential entrepreneurs is actually constrained in terms of location and in terms of competencies, in terms of previous sector where he generally works before becoming an entrepreneur. And this has been discussed by David Story and other scholars very, very deeply from the 90s on. So you have another word that I like as evolutionary economists, you have persistence in terms of location, in terms of competencies, in terms of sectors. Most of new firms come from people that were working in the same sectors as a dependent employee and generally in the same region. So you look at profit expectation constrained by persistence in location and competencies. The income choice model is a little bit better in terms of the economic modeling explaining the entrepreneurial choice because it's at least is comparing the profit expectation with the previous wage. Since most of entrepreneurs, let's say 80% of new entrepreneurs comes from previous jobs, the rest, 20% that is lacking is either a young person starting directly as an entrepreneur or the so-called sequential entrepreneurs that started a firm, failed, and started again. But the 80% coming from a situation of a wage worker. So is the comparison in between profit expectation and wages that is, from an economic point of view, is the key variable. But even this small extension of the traditional model open up a new world. Because if I'm not attracted by the relative profitability, but the comparison in between profit and wages, it could be, well, the case is that I start a new business not because I have very, very good profitability expectation or very good ideas or something that is growing in terms of demand, but just because my wages is going down or my career perspectives are going down or even I'm afraid or I'm actually unemployed. So it's not because profits are high, but because wages, expected wages, are low. And that's actually the case in terms, again, of microeconomic drivers. Industrial structuring, decreasing real wages could actually foster a certain kind of defensive entrepreneurships, and is the component of entrepreneurship that is typically counter-cyclical. Can even come from what has been called escape from unemployment. For instance, UK in the 80s was characterized by new entries and entrepreneurships that was at least partially, but substantially explained by post-industrial kind of restructuring and especially manufacturing escape from unemployment. But this is not enough. I mean, it's an extension that makes the things much more complex, but it's not enough. We also have to think about not economic variables that relate to the actual characteristics, individual characteristics of the potential founder. Job experience, we already talked in a way, but also in terms of competencies and skills. Family background, coming from a kind of family where entrepreneurial tradition is already there, can be an advantage. Individual financial constraints, for instance, there are papers by Evans and Giovanni was the first, but then much more recent, so that say that unexpected wealth is actually fostering entrepreneurships. Psychological attitude, that's really important. If you ask new entrepreneurs about their motivation, most of them, they rank this kind of desire for autonomy, desire for independence, very, very high in the ranking of the motivation. Generally is the first kind of motivation ranked by new entrepreneurs. Is this good or not? My personal attitude is that it's basically a confusing factor. There are a lot of people that actually start a new business because of this willing to be independent, not taking into account the real chance of survival, the real chance of making profits, the real unsatisfied demand that can be exploited. So it's not to be enthusiastic is not a good signal, and it's sometimes correlated to overconfidence. Giovanni Dosi and Lovallo they describe well this kind of overconfidence, but more recently Simon Parker is talking about the possible overconfidence and so excess of entry from a welfare point of view. Okay, last 5 minutes about the possible correlation in between all these different characteristics that are characterized the different animals that range from the aggressive lion, that is a minority, to the very fragile and doomed to failures small cat. So we have this range of different categories and different drivers and different motivation. Can we correlate these kind of characteristics to what happened after entry in terms of survival, post-entry performance, profitability, and so on? I do think that is an exercise that we can run, and I did some kind of empirical stuff on this, of course, together with other scholars that we are going to solve in a way. And the idea is to see whether these kind of relationships are confirmed or not confirmed in developing countries as well. Okay, so the idea is that we are dealing with very, very different animals. We have heterogeneous entrepreneurs. We have diversity, and so we have a very, very different kind of post-entry performances, and to see whether these kind of genetic features are actually affecting the post-entry performance. Size and age, this is something very, very consolidated. A larger entry size is generally a good signal. If you start larger, that means different things. First of all, you are closer to what the IO scholars call the minimum efficient size. That is different in different sectors. And of course, larger you are, closer you are to the minimum efficient size in terms of scale economies and so on. Larger you are, and larger is your commitment in terms of sunk cost in entering new sectors, in entering with new firms into a sectors. So there is a kind of relationships in most studies in between entry size and post-entry performance. On the other hand, there is negative relationships in between size and growth. And so Gibran law is rejected on average. Gibran law is saying a story that you have this kind of equal probability to grow, either you are 5 employees or 500 employees. That is something that in the very long term and as a steady state is working. We work on with Francesca Lotti and Enrico Santarelli on this, and we simulated the kind of steady states in abstraction in a way in the long terms. In the long terms, you can rely on this statistical law. But if you take into account especially the new starters, what you have is a kind of sample selection approach. I mean, conditional on survival. If a new small firm is surviving, that is a minority of firms that actually survive, they have to grow. They must grow. They must grow to reach the minimum efficient size and to enter definitely in the core of the market. So that's you find out a negative relationship that is conditional on survival. If you start very small, you are generally doomed to fail. But if you survive, it's because you are growing much faster than the incumbents. And so that's why Gibran is rejected. And so in terms of age, what you have is that the younger firms, they tend to grow more. And this is studied, for instance, by a recent special issues by ICC that was edited by Paul Nightingale and Alex Code, Werner Herz, and others. Is quoted, maybe not here or maybe later. What happened in developing countries? The evidence we have on different countries tends to confirm the fact that in developing countries, again, size is a good predictor of a better than average percentage performance. Credit constraints, not surprisingly, are actually hampering both the survival and the percentage performance. Even if, as Robert Pressey actually stressed in some old works, sometimes these kind of financial constraints are overemphasized. If you ask an entrepreneur, especially a failed entrepreneur, why, which were the problem? Why didn't you manage to survive and to penetrate the market? They are generally replying and answering, well, because of the banks. The banks are bad. The banks didn't give me the money. Even if my idea was extraordinary, I've not been financed enough. That could be a kind of self-indulgence attitude and can be the consequences of other problems that, of course, are revealed as the main problem, while the main problems are others. It has to be said that in developing countries, generally, this is not overemphasized. Generally, even a fortiori, if we take into account the pervasive presence of corruption, most of new ventures are financially constrained. And there's this paper on small business economics that is really informative by Godiers and Slovakian, revealing that financial constraint is really a major obstacle, at least in the sample of 18 sub-Saharan African countries. Education. This again, Luca will be much more precise in the next seminar about these issues, because he did a lot of work on this. But not surprisingly, even at the macroeconomic level, human capital, education on the one hand, and innovation on the other are predictor of better economic performance and growth. Human capital is particularly important in new technology-based firms, in high-tech sectors. So no problem. Better entrepreneurs in terms of human capital and education are actually more likely to survive and to grow. But then other problems arise. Which kind of human capital and skills? Going back to Becker, to make also a kind of tribute to Gary Becker, specific on general skills. Some people are saying that specific skills are important. For instance, in terms of technical, managerial, technical and scientific fields, especially again in high-tech sectors. Other people, they say, like Lazar, that is contrary, is general skills that are important. And the point by Lazar is that the jack of all trades is the ideal entrepreneur. Since the entrepreneur has to organize different things, different function, has to have a kind of general knowledge of the different aspects in ruling a firm, and so general skills are important. I tend to be skeptical about this, especially taking into account the critique put forward by Thomas Astebro. That is actually finding out, in terms of empirical relationships, that if people are endowed with a kind of taste for variety, there are people that like to be very, very specific, and people that like to have a taste for variety. Well, people that like to diversity they like to have a kind of education, a kind of companies very, very large, and they like also to be entrepreneur because it's a very, very diverse and very, very multifaceted kind of job. But that doesn't mean that the two things are correlated. It's an individual characteristics. So there are some problems, I think, in this kind of view. Anyway, there's this kind of debate. In developing countries, the question is even more complicated. As in developing countries, most of people are actually in the informal economy. And the wage kind of jobs are quite attractive. So sometimes you find the opposite result, that most educated people, they tend to enter the formal labor market as wage earners and not enter the self-employment or the entrepreneurs. That's why sometimes you find a negative correlation between the level of education and the rate of entrepreneurs survival and so on. No, sorry, the rate of entrepreneurs. Even if in this study, another study, but by the same authors, Godiers and Slovakian, they find something consistent with what we found in richer countries. In any case, conditional on starting a new firm, even in developing countries, human capital is important. So within the new firms, entrepreneurs with a higher level of education is actually characterized by an above the average kind of performance. So this is something confirmed in developing countries. Previous jobs, well, we can skip because it's, we already talked about it. Anyway, experience is a good asset, and this is also confirmed in developing countries. 5 minutes, yeah. Innovation, we are in SPRU, so again, I can be fast. Innovation, as at the macroeconomic level, is important for growth, is also a good predictor, a positive predictor of a good percentage performance. And this has been measured by Elena Chafis and Orietta Marsili with a kind of premium in terms of survival by 11%. So innovative new firms have a kind of a likelihood to survive 11% higher than the average. And in using Keith's taxonomy, science-based and specialized suppliers are more likely to perform better. Developing countries is complicated, because developing countries generally they don't have an endogenous kind of innovative capabilities. But if they have some kind of absorptive capacity and they can import innovation, there is some evidence that R&D and innovation are important. And these studies on Vietnamese regions actually seems to support the view that R&D-intensive new firms are more likely to survive and have a better percentage performance. Escape from unemployment, not surprisingly, is correlated negatively to survival and negative to percentage performance. And that's funny because there are a lot of policies that are specifically addressed to the unemployment. So the unemployment is helped with money, with subsidies, to start a new business. Well, this is really problematic because that kind of initiative by escapees from unemployment are generally doomed to a failure. On developing countries, the evidence is very, very scarce. Well, these are, maybe Martin can take the point in the discussion. This is a kind of sociological category that is particularly important in developing countries. It has been demonstrated that alien minorities are much more entrepreneurial than the average. And that's for different reasons. For a kind of internal networking, kind of social cohesion within the minority, kind of emulation and attempt to react to a kind of discrimination that an alien minority can have inside the country. So, for instance, Asian minorities in Africa, they are much more prone to start new firms, and this has been confirmed by a bunch of studies. And it's a kind of topic very, very specific to developed countries. So, conclusion. Controversial phenomenon, very, very different animals, from the cat to the lion. Therefore, to be very, very provocative, we can even conclude that we have to drop the word entrepreneur, substituting and talking about founder, much more neutral. Founder is a guy that is, or a woman that is starting a new business. We don't know ex ante whether is an entrepreneur, a real entrepreneur or not. There are entry mistakes. There are a lot of churning and turbulence. So we have to be very, very cautious. And these kind of animals are driven by very, very different determinants. And we very different likelihood to survive and to have a good percentage performance. So we can have positive predictors like innovation and human capital, and negative predictor like a previous state of unemployment or a low level of education. So policy. Umbrella ergo omnes entry subsidies are really, really a waste. Why? Either they are affected by the so-called dead weight effects. So he is very clever, he is innovative, and we have very good education, PhD at SPRU. I'm giving him money to start a new business, and this is useless, because in any case, he would have performed well. On the other hand, if I give money to something that is bad, and ex ante, the likelihood to give money to firms doomed to failures is about 50%, is even worse, is counterproductive, because I'm actually crowding out and displacing better initiatives, giving money to the, so I'm making adverse selection. So this should be avoided. A possibility is to target a kind of particular population, for instance, the most innovative, for instance, the most educated, for instance, the new technology-based firms in the high-tech sector. This is a possibility, but of course, in order to avoid the dead weight effect, that has been done where you have a kind of market failures. So it's clever, it's good idea, is innovative, is a good PhD, but it's financially constrained. And banks, they don't believe in his idea. In that case, it's a market failures in the capital market, and the subsidy is actually something that could be accepted in richer countries. In developing countries, of course, these kind of market failures are spread around. A lot of market and institutional failures. So the scope for subsidizing new entries is much larger than in richer countries. So even developing countries, we should be cautious and parsimonious. Here, the